Mobile computing has changed nearly everything about technology, not only how it works, but also who owns it. As the technology went mainstream, companies found basic mobile patents in the hands of other companies that weren't even trying to make those very products. It's created a dissonance between the innovators and those who own the rights to that innovation, one that's left Apple, Google, even Samsung without the rights to their own technology. For more on this story, let's head back to Cory at the Web 2.0 conference in San Francisco. Cory?
Yeah, Emily, this whole battle of patents has just erupted with companies' valuations going bonkers, whether it's InterDigital, a patent holder, or Kodak, a patent seller, and then there's Motorola, Google. You've been looking at, David Martin, at all this stuff for a long time, the notions of intellectual property, but right down to the nuts and bolts. Let's go to the nuts and bolts first. Motorola's acquisition, Google's acquisition of Motorola MMI, the ticker, that was thought to be a salvation for them, is it?
Well, it was thought to be a salvation, but as we're finding out, the Justice Department is taking a look at that. As you saw recently, there was a revised request from the Justice Department for new information. There is a growing concern that there is this broad issue of whether or not the patents that are being aggregated represent pools. So there's a huge antitrust issue. Well, explain that to me, because a patent, I mean, there are piles of patents. Are there a couple of companies whose valuations are based entirely on the owning of patents, not on doing anything with them? Exactly. So you have a Rambus or an InterDigital, like you just talked about, where the core of the enterprise value is nothing but patents.
Right.
Those are actually companies whose business it is to actually make something of value. So in Rambus, it's, well, no, because it's very clear. In Rambus, they're designing things. They're actually making a thing, and it happens to be designed. The way you protect the design happens to be in the patent. InterDigital is getting closer to the edge, but InterDigital still would say that they are actually coming up with standards-based approaches to solve industry problems. That's very different from companies that are purely aggregating third-party properties. And the Justice Department history on this goes back into the 1800s. As most people seem to be unaware, the Sherman Act explicitly prohibits patent pooling.
This is the Sherman Antitrust Act.
This is Sherman Antitrust. This is the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act. And so if you go back to the early 1900s, cases like National Hero, which we all remember, right?
National Hero, I think I was a shareholder.
National Hero, we were all there, right? Cases like that where you have
National Buggy Whip that didn't work out so
National Buggy Whip crashed.
Right.
National Hero, Singer sewing machines, the aircraft monopoly of World War I, the very famous aircraft monopoly where a bunch of patents on aircraft were pooled together.
Right.
All of these pools were put together where operating businesses that actually made something had to come together and share their technology. And the doctrine of patent pooling, which is viewed as pro-competitive and viewed as a positive thing, is where industry players that make critical components have to share their technology.
So what does this mean for Google Motorola then, in the most pernicious view towards the merger, would look at it and say what?
Well, in the case of this particular merger, what Google is trying to do is come up with a late-stage approach to try to defend itself against a number of parties who were at the game a lot faster and a lot earlier.
Let me paraphrase that. So in other words, you're saying Google made the phone without the patents. Now they're trying to buy the patents to save their invention.
To backfill what they already have. Well, what's wrong with that is you have to buy the right thing. If you don't buy the right thing and you buy just a bunch of indiscriminate patents, you actually wind up having a very significant problem with respect to the actual antitrust problem. Because the antitrust problem kicks in when you have essentially blind patents where you don't know which component of a patent is actually contributing to a technology. And if you didn't build your technology on a patent, in other words, you didn't have the spec of the patent to build the thing, and then you run around the world trying to aggregate those patents which might read on the product that you're trying to sell, you run into problems like Samsung's running into, like HTC's running into, like Apple's running into, and these problems are getting much more expansive. So when you think about what's happening in the current environment, this Cold War cost strategy is based on a series of patents that were issued in these broad and expansive language kind of ways. Where now all of a sudden every one of them appears to read on the products that are being sold.
But by that logic, no one could ever buy a patent.
Well, one would think that you would have a logic that says that nobody would want to buy a patent. The problem now is that the cost of figuring out what is actually in a patent is so prohibitive, and it is so expensive to go down the pathway of trying to figure out what's in portfolios, that as a practical matter, companies are just saying, we're going to buy a bunch of them, make the cost of discovery so high that it is impossible for anybody to figure out what we actually have, and then go down the pathway like Samsung is doing right now on the Apple case.
Where Samsung's been kicked out of Australia,
hey,
or the devices are no longer able to be sold in Australia.
The Samsung Australia question, the Netherlands question, all of these places where Apple said the tablet, the Galaxy tablet, can't be sold, Samsung's now turning over that very dynamic and saying, well, we're going to block Apple from the same markets. So now ITC actions that are being filed that say Apple's not going to be sold in Australia. Apple's not going to be sold in all these other markets. The big one right now is Japan. And that is based on an old November of 2010 decision where Samsung got into the Cold War strategy, got a bunch of licenses to all these patents, and now they have to figure out how to recoup that expensive cost.
This is going to be really interesting to see if the Justice Department can figure this out and if they decide to block the merger on this basis.
Well, remember that the Justice Department has not yet come to a determination on how to figure out pools.
We'll see if they figure that out. All right, David Martin, thanks a lot from MCAM. Really appreciate that insight.